The cruelest part wasn't that her daughter forgot her birthday. It was discovering the entire family had celebrated together without her. Before we begin, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below because stories like Margaret Whitmore's happen more often than people want to admit. At exactly 6:12 on a rainy Thursday evening in Hartford, Connecticut, Margaret adjusted the candles on her small vanilla birthday cake for the third time. The dining room table looked beautiful in the soft yellow light hanging above it. She had folded cloth napkins, polished the silverware, and even brought out the floral plates her late husband used to love. A pot roast sat warming in the oven beside homemade mashed potatoes and green beans with almonds, the same meal her daughter Emily had begged for every birthday growing up. Margaret glanced at her phone again. No new messages. Outside, rain tapped steadily against the windows, while the grandfather clock in the hallway ticked loud enough to make the empty house feel even lonelier. Emily had promised she would try to stop by after work with the kids. Margaret knew that word by now. Try. It was the same word Emily used every Thanksgiving, every Christmas brunch, every Sunday lunch that somehow never happened anymore. Still, Margaret waited. She always waited. At 67 years old, Margaret had spent most of her life believing family required patience. She had raised Emily alone after her husband died of a heart attack 12 years earlier. She had worked double shifts at the public library, skipped vacations, and drained half her savings helping Emily and her husband buy their first home in Boston. Even after retirement, Margaret drove nearly 2 hours twice a month just to babysit her grandchildren so Emily could finally get a break. And yet lately, every conversation felt rushed, every visit shorter than the last. At 7:04 p.m., Margaret's phone finally buzzed. Her face brightened instantly, but the smile disappeared almost as quickly as it came. "Sorry, Mom, something came up. Rain check?" That was it. No call, no explanation, no happy birthday. Margaret stared at the screen for several seconds before quietly setting the phone face down beside her untouched plate. The silence in the room suddenly felt unbearable. She forced herself to cut a slice of cake anyway, even though her appetite had vanished. The candle smoke curled slowly into the air while tears burned behind her eyes. But Margaret didn't cry. Not anymore. Somewhere along the way, disappointment had become too familiar to cry over. Around 9:30 that night, she turned off the kitchen lights and carried the leftovers into the refrigerator one container at a time. The house felt colder than usual. Before heading upstairs, she paused at the framed family photo hanging near the staircase. Emily stood smiling beside her husband and children during last summer's 4th of July barbecue. Margaret remembered taking that picture herself because no one had asked her to stand in it. She stared at the frame for a long moment before quietly whispering to the empty hallway, "Maybe next year." But deep down, something inside her already knew next year would not be any different. The next morning, Margaret woke up earlier than usual after barely sleeping through the night. Gray sunlight filtered through the kitchen curtains while the coffee maker hummed softly on the counter. For a few seconds, she convinced herself she was overreacting. Emily was busy. Families got overwhelmed sometimes. Life moved fast. That was what everyone kept saying these days. Margaret carried her coffee to the small breakfast table and reached for her phone, mostly out of habit. The screen lit up with several notifications from Facebook. One of Emily's posts had suddenly exploded with comments overnight. Margaret tapped the notification absent-mindedly, expecting pictures of the children or maybe a recipe Emily wanted to share. Instead, her breath caught so sharply she nearly dropped the phone. The first photo showed Emily standing on the deck of a massive white cruise ship beneath bright Caribbean sunshine. Her husband Jason stood beside her wearing sunglasses and holding a tropical drink while the grandchildren leaned against the railing grinning ear to ear. The ocean behind them stretched endlessly blue beneath a cloudless sky. Margaret stared at the picture without moving. Then she swiped to the next one, and the next, and the next. There they were eating lobster dinners beneath sparkling chandeliers. There they were watching dolphins beside the ship. There they were wrapped in matching white sweaters during sunset. One photo showed Emily hugging her daughter tightly while the caption read, "Making unforgettable family memories together." Margaret felt her stomach twist painfully. Family memories. Her eyes moved slowly back to the date stamp. The pictures had been taken the exact same night she sat alone at her dining room table staring at melting birthday candles. Emily had not been busy. Emily had not forgotten. Emily had boarded a 7-day Bahamas cruise with the entire family and never told her own mother it was happening. Margaret zoomed in on one picture, suddenly noticing something even worse. Her grandson Tyler wore the navy blue polo shirt she bought him 2 weeks earlier for his school awards ceremony. That meant he had known about the trip while Margaret babysat him that weekend. He had smiled at her, hugged her goodbye, and said nothing. A dull ache settled deep in Margaret's chest. She kept scrolling despite herself. Hundreds of comments flooded beneath the post. "Beautiful family. Goals. You are such an amazing daughter and mother, Emily." Margaret swallowed hard when she noticed Emily replying to almost every comment except one. Near the bottom sat a short message from Margaret's longtime church friend Diane. "Hope your mother is doing okay after spending her birthday alone yesterday." There was no response from Emily beneath it. None at all. Margaret set the phone down carefully on the table as though it had suddenly become fragile. The kitchen around her felt strangely quiet except for the ticking wall clock and distant rainwater dripping from the gutters outside. For several minutes, she simply sat there staring at nothing. Then, slowly, memories began surfacing one after another like puzzle pieces finally fitting together. The canceled dinners, the missed holidays, the rushed phone calls, the way Emily always seemed distracted lately unless she needed something. Margaret suddenly realized this was not one painful mistake. This had been happening for years. She just had not wanted to see it. Across the room, the untouched birthday cake still sat beneath its plastic cover on the counter. Margaret looked at it for a long moment before quietly standing up, carrying it to the trash can, and dropping the entire thing inside without saving a single slice. For the rest of that week, Margaret moved through her quiet house like someone trying not to disturb a painful truth that had finally awakened. She watered the flowers on the porch, folded laundry, and attended her Thursday morning church group exactly as she always did, but something inside her had shifted permanently. Every routine suddenly felt different now that she understood she had not simply been forgotten, she had been excluded, deliberately. On Friday afternoon, Margaret stopped at a grocery store near her neighborhood to pick up soup and coffee filters. As she reached for a carton of milk, she heard a familiar voice behind her. "Margaret, oh my goodness, how are you?" She turned to see Carol Jensen smiling warmly beside her shopping cart. Carol and her husband had lived 3 houses down from Emily for years. Margaret forced a polite smile. "I am doing fine, Carol. How are you?" Carol leaned closer with the casual friendliness of someone making conversation. "I saw those cruise pictures online. That ship looked incredible. I cannot believe Emily managed to organize such a big family vacation." Margaret felt her fingers tighten slightly around the milk carton. "Yes," she answered carefully. "It certainly looked nice." Carol continued talking, unaware of the damage each sentence caused. "I almost spoiled the surprise months ago when Emily mentioned the trip during Tyler's soccer game. She said everyone had been planning it forever." Months ago. Margaret nodded slowly while her heartbeat thudded painfully in her chest. "That sounds like Emily," she said softly. Carol suddenly paused, finally noticing something was wrong. "Wait, you did go with them, right?" Margaret gave a small smile that barely held together. "No, I was not invited." The expression on Carol's face changed instantly from cheerful to horrified. "Margaret, I thought." She stopped herself awkwardly. Margaret rescued her with a gentle shake of the head. "It is all right." But it was not all right. The drive home felt longer than usual. Rain clouds gathered overhead while old memories replayed themselves one after another in Margaret's mind. She remembered last Christmas when Emily insisted the family celebrate at Jason's sister's house instead because it would just be easier. Margaret had spent Christmas morning alone watching old movies with her dog sleeping beside the couch. She remembered Emily canceling Mother's Day brunch 2 years earlier because the children were too exhausted after a weekend trip to Disney World. She remembered the growing number of family photos posted online that Margaret only discovered after events had already happened. Every painful moment suddenly connected together with brutal clarity. By the time Margaret pulled into her driveway, she no longer felt confused. She felt embarrassed. Embarrassed that she had spent years making excuses for people who clearly no longer prioritized her place in their lives. Inside the house, she sat quietly at the kitchen table while afternoon sunlight faded through the windows. Her phone buzzed suddenly with a text message from Emily. "Hey Mom, sorry I have been busy. The cruise Wi-Fi was terrible lol. We should grab lunch sometime next week." Margaret stared at the message for several seconds. Not one mention of her birthday, not one apology, not even acknowledgement that she had discovered the trip online like a stranger peeking through someone else's family album. The tiny lol at the end somehow hurt most of all. Margaret placed the phone down slowly without replying. Then she opened the drawer beside the refrigerator and pulled out a small notebook where she tracked her monthly expenses. For years, one section had remained almost untouched because she never thought twice about helping Emily whenever money became tight. School tuition for the grandchildren, emergency car repairs, mortgage assistance during slow business months, plane tickets, medical bills. Thousands upon thousands of dollars quietly transferred over time because Margaret believed family took care of each other. But as she flipped through the pages that afternoon, another realization settled heavily into her chest. Emily had never once asked whether Margaret herself was doing all right. Over the next several days, Margaret stopped checking Emily's social media page, but the images refused to leave her mind. Everywhere she looked inside her home, reminders of her daughter surrounded her. School portraits lined the hallway walls. Handmade Mother's Day cards still sat carefully stored inside a cedar chest upstairs. Even the kitchen carried traces of Emily's childhood because Margaret had never redecorated after her daughter moved out. For years, those memories brought comfort. Now they only raised painful questions Margaret could no longer avoid asking herself. On Sunday morning after church, Margaret returned home and sat alone on the back patio with a cup of tea while cold autumn wind rustled through the trees behind her yard. Her neighbor Diane eventually walked over carrying a small container of homemade banana bread. "I figured you could use something sweet," Diane said gently as she sat beside her. Margaret smiled politely and thanked her. For a few minutes they talked about ordinary things like the weather and rising grocery prices before Diane carefully asked, "Have you heard from Emily since the trip?" Margaret looked down into her tea. She sent a text. Diane waited quietly. She acted like nothing happened, Margaret finally admitted. Diane sighed softly. "Margaret, can I tell you something honestly?" Margaret nodded. Diane hesitated before speaking. "People in town have noticed for a while that your daughter only seems to come around when she needs something." The words stung, not because they were cruel, but because Margaret already knew they were true. Diane continued carefully. "You are one of the kindest women I know, but sometimes kind people get used because they are too afraid to stop giving." Margaret forced a small smile. "Emily has a busy life." Diane gently shook her head. "Busy people still make time for the people they love." After Diane left, Margaret sat outside for nearly an hour replaying those words. Busy people still make time. Suddenly, memories surfaced faster than she could push them away. 3 years earlier, Emily called crying because Jason's construction business had struggled during the winter. Margaret quietly withdrew $15,000 from her retirement account to help cover their mortgage payments. Emily promised to repay her someday, but the subject was never mentioned again. The year after that, Margaret paid for Tyler's private summer camp because Emily said the children deserved opportunities she never had growing up. Last spring, Margaret canceled her own long-awaited senior bus tour through Vermont because Emily begged her to babysit during a couple's vacation to Napa Valley. Margaret remembered sitting alone at home that weekend, scrolling through photos of wine tastings and luxury hotel rooms while reheating leftover soup in the microwave. At the time, she convinced herself sacrifice was simply what mothers did, but now another painful realization settled into place. Emily never sacrificed for her. Later that evening, Margaret opened her banking app on the laptop and carefully reviewed years of transfers, checks, and emergency expenses connected to Emily's family. The total made her stomach tighten. It was not just the money that hurt. It was the pattern. Emily always sounded warmest when asking for help. "You are a lifesaver, Mom. I do not know what we would do without you. The kids adore you." Yet once the crisis passed, the calls became shorter. The invitations disappeared. The appreciation faded until the next problem arrived. Margaret closed the laptop slowly and stared across the quiet living room. For the first time in many years, she allowed herself to ask a question she had avoided her entire life. What if Emily did not actually value her mother at all? What if she only valued what her mother provided? The thought felt unbearable. But somehow, pretending otherwise suddenly felt even worse. Monday morning arrived with clear skies and sharp autumn air drifting through the neighborhood. Margaret stood in front of her bedroom mirror, fastening a pair of pearl earrings she had not worn in years. Something about her reflection looked unfamiliar lately. Not younger, not happier, just calmer, more awake. For the first time in a very long while, Margaret no longer felt desperate to hold her family together by herself. That realization frightened her almost as much as it relieved her. After breakfast, she drove downtown to meet with Harold Bennett, the financial advisor who had handled her retirement account since her husband passed away. Harold greeted her warmly inside his office overlooking Main Street. "Margaret, it is good to see you. What can I help you with today?" Margaret folded her hands carefully in her lap. "I would like to review my estate plans and monthly distributions." Harold adjusted his glasses slightly. Of course. For years, Margaret had structured nearly everything around Emily and the grandchildren. Emergency access to accounts, automatic monthly transfers, educational funds, even partial ownership arrangements connected to her house someday passing directly to Emily. At the time, it felt natural. Margaret believed taking care of family meant preparing for their future before her own comfort. But sitting inside that quiet office now, she finally heard how one-sided it all sounded. Harold reviewed the paperwork while Margaret stared silently out the window at pedestrians crossing the street below. "Would you like to continue the automatic transfers to Emily's household account?" he asked gently. Margaret paused longer than expected. Then she answered softly, "No, I think it is time to stop those." Harold looked surprised but nodded professionally. "All right." Margaret inhaled slowly. "And I would also like to update the beneficiaries on several accounts." The words felt strangely heavy leaving her mouth, yet once spoken, they also felt freeing. By the time the meeting ended, Margaret walked outside carrying a folder of updated documents and a feeling she had almost forgotten existed. Control. That afternoon, instead of driving straight home, she stopped at a small cafe near the riverfront and ordered clam chowder and hot tea. Normally, she avoided eating alone in public because it reminded her too much of how isolated her life had become. But today felt different somehow. As she sat near the window, she noticed a flyer posted beside the register advertising a senior women's travel group planning a 12-day New England coastal cruise the following spring. Margaret stared at the flyer for several seconds before quietly pulling one of the tabs from the bottom. Later that evening, her phone rang while she watered plants in the kitchen. Emily's name flashed across the screen. Margaret let it ring twice before answering. "Hi, Mom," Emily said casually. Loud television noise echoed in the background. "Hey, sweetheart," Margaret replied evenly. Listen, I hate asking, but Jason and I are in a little bind after the trip. Tyler needs braces sooner than expected, and things are kind of tight right now. Do you think you could help us out this month? Margaret closed her eyes briefly. Not once had Emily asked how her birthday went. Not once had she apologized. But she needed something again. Margaret set the watering can down carefully beside the sink. I am afraid I cannot do that anymore, Emily. Silence filled the line for several seconds. What do you mean? Emily finally asked, confusion creeping into her voice. Margaret kept her tone calm. I mean, I need to start focusing more on my own finances and my own life. Emily gave a nervous laugh. Mom, it is not that much money. Margaret looked out the kitchen window into the darkening yard. That is not really the point. Another uncomfortable silence followed. Then Emily's voice changed slightly, becoming colder beneath the forced politeness. Okay, well, I guess we will figure something out. I am sure you will, Margaret answered gently. After the call ended, Margaret stood motionless in the quiet kitchen. Normally, guilt would have consumed her instantly. Normally, she would have called back within minutes and offered help anyway. But tonight something unexpected happened instead. She felt peaceful. For the first time in years, Margaret had chosen herself without apologizing for it. Over the following weeks, Emily began noticing changes she could not quite understand. Her mother still answered phone calls politely. She still spoke kindly during conversations, but something essential had disappeared from the relationship, and Emily felt it almost immediately. Margaret no longer called first. She no longer texted reminders about doctor appointments for the children or asked whether anyone needed groceries before a snowstorm. Most noticeably of all, she stopped offering help before being asked. At first, Emily assumed her mother was simply upset about the birthday situation. She will get over it, Emily told Jason one evening while unloading takeout containers onto the kitchen counter. Jason glanced up from his laptop. Maybe you should apologize. Emily rolled her eyes lightly. For what? We already paid for the cruise before I realized it landed on her birthday week. Jason did not respond. Deep down, even Emily knew that explanation sounded weak. 2 Fridays later, Emily called Margaret in a rush while sitting in the parking lot outside Tyler's orthodontist office. Mom, I completely forgot Tyler has early dismissal next Thursday. Can you pick him up from school and watch him until dinner? Normally, Margaret would have answered yes before the sentence even finished. This time, however, there was a pause. I am sorry, sweetheart, Margaret said calmly. I already have plans that afternoon. Emily blinked in surprise. Plans? Yes. What kind of plans? The question slipped out sharper than Emily intended. Margaret's voice remained steady. I joined a local travel club for seniors. We are meeting downtown. Emily leaned back against the driver's seat, confused by the unfamiliar answer. You joined a club? I did. Another silence followed. Emily suddenly realized she knew almost nothing about her mother's life outside of what she needed from her. Well, okay, Emily finally muttered. I guess I will figure something out. I am sure you will, Margaret answered gently, using the exact same words Emily once used on her. After hanging up, Emily felt strangely irritated. Not guilty, irritated. It annoyed her that her mother suddenly seemed unavailable after years of always being there, whenever needed. Meanwhile, Margaret's life quietly began expanding in ways she had not expected. The travel club met every Thursday afternoon inside a restored historic hotel overlooking the Connecticut River. Most of the members were widows or retired women in their 60s and 70s who spent years caring for children, husbands, and relatives before finally deciding to enjoy their own lives. Margaret listened to stories about cross-country train trips, Alaskan cruises, and weekend jazz festivals in New Orleans. For the first time in years, conversations did not revolve around someone needing something from her. One afternoon after the meeting, several women invited Margaret to lunch at a seafood restaurant nearby. As they laughed over bowls of chowder and shared photos from past vacations, Margaret realized something shocking. She felt lighter away from her family than she did around them. Back in Boston, however, stress inside Emily's household steadily grew. Without Margaret's financial help and constant availability, small inconveniences suddenly became expensive problems. Babysitters cost money. Emergency school pickups disrupted work schedules. The children complained about seeing Grandma less often. Even Jason quietly noticed the difference. One evening, while sorting bills at the kitchen island, Emily sighed heavily. "I do not understand why she is acting so distant lately." Jason looked at her carefully before answering. Maybe she got tired of feeling invisible. Emily frowned immediately. "That is dramatic." Jason closed the folder in front of him. "Is it?" The question lingered uncomfortably between them long after the conversation ended. But across the state line in Hartford, Margaret sat peacefully at her dining room table, filling out paperwork for the spring coastal cruise she planned to take alone. For the first time in decades, she was planning a future that did not revolve around waiting for someone else to include her. By late November, the distance between Margaret and Emily had become impossible for the rest of the family to ignore. Phone calls grew shorter. Invitations became awkward and carefully worded. Even the grandchildren sensed something had changed, though nobody explained it directly. Still, when Thanksgiving approached, Emily insisted everyone gather at her house outside Boston like they always did. "It will be good for Mom," she told Jason while arranging decorative pumpkins across the dining room table. "We just need one normal holiday." But deep down, Emily was nervous. She expected Margaret to arrive withdrawn or emotional, maybe even eager to repair things. What she did not expect was the woman who stepped through the front door that Thursday afternoon. Margaret entered wearing a cream-colored wool coat, pearl earrings, and a calm expression Emily had not seen in years. Her silver hair was freshly styled, and there was an unmistakable confidence in the way she carried herself now. She no longer looked like someone waiting for permission to belong. "Mom, you look nice," Emily said, sounding almost surprised. Margaret smiled politely. "Thank you, sweetheart." Jason greeted her warmly while the grandchildren hugged her excitedly. For a few moments, everything felt almost normal. But as the afternoon unfolded, Emily slowly realized her mother had changed in ways she could not control. Margaret no longer hovered in the kitchen, offering help before being asked. She no longer rushed to clean dishes or entertain the children while everyone else relaxed. Instead, she sat comfortably in the living room speaking with Jason's parents about travel plans, local theater shows, and a coastal cruise she planned to take in the spring. Several relatives listened with genuine interest. "You are going alone?" Jason's mother asked. Margaret smiled softly. "Not exactly. I joined a wonderful travel group recently. We have already booked 2 more trips after that one." Emily overheard the conversation while carrying drinks from the kitchen. Something about hearing her mother talk about a life that did not revolve around family responsibilities unsettled her deeply. During dinner, the tension became harder to ignore. Emily noticed Margaret laughing more with distant relatives than with her own daughter. Even the grandchildren seemed surprised by how relaxed their grandmother appeared. At one point, Tyler asked innocently, "Grandma, are you really going on a cruise?" Margaret nodded warmly. "I am. Can we come too?" Margaret smiled gently but shook her head. "This one is just for me." The answer landed harder than anyone expected. Later that evening, while guests gathered around dessert in the dining room, Emily finally cornered her mother near the hallway. "Mom, can I ask you something?" Margaret looked up calmly. "Of course." Emily lowered her voice. "Why have you been acting so distant lately?" For a brief second, silence hung between them while muffled laughter echoed from the dining room nearby. Then Margaret gave a small, almost sad smile. People stop waiting at the table when they realize they were never invited to sit there in the first place. Emily stared at her speechless. The words were not loud, they were not angry, but they cut through the room sharper than shouting ever could. Jason, standing only a few feet away, quietly looked down at the floor. Even Emily's Aunt Denise glanced uncomfortably toward the kitchen after overhearing the exchange. For the first time, the polished image Emily spent years presenting to everyone around her began to crack. Because suddenly, people were remembering things. The missed holidays, the empty chair at family events, the countless times Margaret showed up for everyone else while no one seemed to show up for her. Emily crossed her arms defensively. That is not fair. Margaret held her gaze steadily. No, sweetheart, it was not. Then, without another word, Margaret walked calmly back toward the dining room, while the silence she left behind said far more than any argument ever could. After Thanksgiving, something subtle but undeniable shifted within the family. The carefully polished image Emily had spent years building no longer looked quite as convincing to the people around her. Nobody confronted her directly. Nobody caused drama. But small reactions began piling up in ways she could feel. Her Aunt Denise stopped praising every social media post. Jason's mother became noticeably warmer toward Margaret during phone calls. Even neighbors who once admired Emily's perfect family life now seemed strangely quiet whenever family topics came up. Emily hated it. One Saturday morning in December, she sat curled on the couch scrolling through Facebook while holiday commercials played softly in the background. Her jaw tightened as she noticed several relatives commenting on photos Margaret recently posted from her senior travel club luncheon downtown. Margaret stood smiling beside a group of elegant women at a waterfront restaurant, wearing a navy blue sweater and pearl earrings. "You look radiant," one comment read. "So happy to see you enjoying yourself." Another added. Emily frowned. Her mother never used to post things like that. Normally, Margaret's social media only contained birthday wishes for grandchildren or photos of homemade pies during holidays. Now there were pictures of museum visits, theater outings, and smiling lunches with friends Emily had never heard of before. What bothered her most was how genuinely happy Margaret looked without them. Later that evening, Jason walked into the kitchen and found Emily staring at her phone again. "You all right?" he asked. Emily tossed the phone onto the counter. "Everyone suddenly acts like my mother is some tragic abandoned widow." Jason leaned against the refrigerator quietly. Maybe people are finally noticing things. Emily crossed her arms defensively. "You keep saying that." Jason hesitated before answering. "Because it is true." Emily scoffed softly. "Mom always chose to help us." "Yes," Jason replied calmly. "But did anyone ever ask what she needed in return?" Emily opened her mouth to argue, then stopped. The uncomfortable truth was becoming harder to ignore. Since Margaret stepped back, their lives had become noticeably more difficult. Babysitting costs added up quickly. Emergency favors disappeared. Weekend errands became stressful without someone always available to step in. But even beyond the practical inconvenience, Emily felt something else she could not admit out loud. She missed being emotionally centered in her mother's world. For decades, Margaret's attention, energy, and loyalty revolved entirely around her daughter. Now that attention had shifted elsewhere, and Emily suddenly realized how much she took it for granted. Meanwhile, Margaret continued quietly rebuilding her life piece by piece. A week before Christmas, she attended a holiday concert with friends from the travel club, followed by dinner at a historic inn decorated with white lights and evergreen garlands. At one point during the evening, one of the women raised a glass and smiled at Margaret. "You know, when you first joined us, you looked heartbroken." Margaret laughed softly. "I probably was." The woman nodded kindly. "You do not anymore." Driving home through softly falling snow that night, Margaret thought about those words carefully. For the first time in years, she no longer woke up every morning wondering who might need something from her. She no longer sat beside the phone, hoping for invitations that rarely came. Most importantly, she no longer blamed herself for being excluded from spaces where her presence had never truly been valued. Back in Boston, Emily stood alone in the kitchen wrapping Christmas presents while her family slept upstairs. Almost absent-mindedly, she opened Facebook again and stared at the latest photo Margaret posted earlier that evening. Her mother sat laughing beside friends around a candlelit dinner table, looking relaxed, confident, and strangely younger than before. Beneath the photo, Diane had commented something simple that made Emily's stomach tighten instantly. "It is beautiful seeing Margaret finally treated the way she deserves." Emily stared at the sentence for a very long time before quietly locking her phone screen and setting it face down on the counter. By early spring, Margaret's life no longer resembled the lonely routine she once clung to so desperately. Her calendar stayed full now: lunches with friends, theater nights in Hartford, weekend train rides through coastal towns she had never bothered visiting before because she spent so many years waiting around for family plans that rarely included her anyway. Most importantly, the ache that once followed her everywhere had finally started fading. Not because Emily apologized. She never truly did. But because Margaret slowly stopped measuring her worth through the attention of people who only valued her when she was useful. On a bright April morning, Margaret stood aboard a luxury cruise ship departing from New York Harbor alongside several women from her travel club. Cold ocean wind lifted strands of silver hair around her face while seagulls circled overhead. The skyline slowly faded behind them as the ship moved toward open water. Margaret rested both hands along the railing and closed her eyes briefly, breathing in salty air she once thought she would never experience herself. A year earlier, she would have spent this moment babysitting grandchildren while scrolling through someone else's vacation photos online. Now she was finally creating memories of her own. Around noon, Margaret returned to her cabin and noticed her phone vibrating repeatedly on the small desk beside the window. 3 missed calls from Emily, 1 voicemail, then a text message appeared seconds later. "Mom, can we talk?" Margaret stared at the screen quietly. Another message followed almost immediately. "I know things have been weird between us lately." Then another. "The kids miss you." Margaret sat slowly on the edge of the bed while sunlight reflected softly across the water outside her balcony. For a long moment, she simply looked at the messages without opening the voicemail. Deep down, part of her still loved Emily fiercely because mothers rarely stop loving their children no matter how deeply they are hurt. But something else had changed too. Margaret finally understood that love without respect slowly destroys the person doing all the giving. A gentle knock sounded at her cabin door. It was Diane from the travel group, smiling brightly. "We are heading upstairs for lunch. Are you coming?" Margaret looked once more at the glowing phone screen in her hand. Then, calmly, she pressed the side button and locked it without replying. "Yes," she answered softly as she stood up. Together the women walked toward the upper deck while sunlight danced across endless blue water surrounding the ship. Laughter echoed nearby as passengers gathered for afternoon music and seafood buffets. Margaret paused briefly near the railing again, watching waves stretch endlessly toward the horizon. For years, she believed being needed was the same thing as being loved. She spent birthdays alone, canceled dreams, drained savings, and accepted disappointment after disappointment because she thought sacrifice guaranteed belonging. But standing there beneath the open sky, Margaret finally understood something that changed everything. People who truly value someone do not hide vacations from them. They do not leave them sitting alone beside untouched birthday cake while pretending online that family means everything. And they certainly do not wait until support disappears before suddenly remembering how much that person matters. Somewhere back in Boston, Emily was probably still waiting for a reply that would not come right away. For once, Margaret was not rushing to fix the discomfort someone else created. The ship's horn echoed powerfully across the ocean as wind swept through her coat and sunlight warmed her face. Margaret smiled quietly to herself before turning toward the crowded upper deck where friends waited for her with open seats at the table. This time, she was no longer the woman standing outside the photograph, wishing she had been invited inside.